This week, someone in our office received a text from Bernie Sanders. She said, "Well, why why am I receiving a text from Bernie Sanders?" He was asking her for money to support a candidate he was endorsing. I said, "Well, that tells us a couple things. It tells us that Bernie Sanders has been marginalized into a fundraising mechanism, and that it's ironic that someone who thought that Donald Trump was the greatest existential threat turned out himself to be the victim of his own party." Welcome to Conservative Coffee Hour. I'm Stanley Smith. At Conservative Coffee Hour, we talk about issues and topics which actually mean something in people's lives. In our time at Conservative Coffee Hour, we found that politics can be dirty business. People can be rude, obnoxious, and abusive, and that's people in our own party talking to ourselves. This week, I had the occasion of overhearing some, especially I thought it was distasteful, dirty trick story at the in the shower room at the East Bank Club. I overheard people talking about Dr. Wilson's candidacy for mayor of the city of Chicago, and they said, yes, Mr. Wilson has no chance of becoming mayor because he's dying of cancer. I thought that was particularly disturbing, especially since I had met Mr. Wilson in real life just a month ago, and he seemed perfectly fine. I usually don't like to share gossip or salacious stories, but I felt it necessary to track that one down. So I did contact his campaign, and indeed that story is entirely erroneous. It's an example of a political hit piece, and it's really distasteful and discouraging. Similar to that, about a month ago, I received a story at church, actually, about how comment from someone about how Cindy Bailey is a terrible dresser. And similar to the Dr. Wilson story, I thought that was distasteful, and I did debate about, wow, is that something that needs to be tracked down or shared? And I've talked to Cindy on this very call, and she's a lovely and charming person, and I didn't share it because I thought, well, that's something really almost beyond the pale. But in this political life, this particular arena we seem to be in, it seems like everything is actually everything and nothing. Those are nothing stories. The way someone dresses is really meaningless in the big picture, especially when it's not true. But if those are the things we need to look at, then I guess that's where we are, and that tells us a lot. Bernie Sanders being marginalized by his own party as a fundraising mechanism reminds me of the story of the Tea Party, which was a movement, a very popular grassroots movement. I remember it being in the 90s, going to rallies, but Google tells us that it started in 2009 as a reaction to the Obama presidency, which I think that's revisionist history because it's not how I remember it. But I remember it as a movement about government spending and overreach and just growing too large. And it was a grassroots movement that was pretty much closed down and marginalized. And as I understand it today, it essentially exists as a fundraising mechanism for the Republican Party. So none of us want to be marginalized or put in a box. I personally didn't have a problem with Bernie Sanders. I didn't agree with anything he stood for, but I appreciated his approach that the system is corrupt. He saw it as corrupt, and it needed to be reformed. And I saw him essentially as the other side of the Donald Trump coin. I don't care which side of the spectrum you're on. I think in many cases we have more in common than you might imagine. My super lib friend who was receiving the text message from uh, Mr. Bernie Sanders asked me later, what do you think of that Darren Bailey guy? And before I could answer, she said, I when I heard what he had to say about abortion, she said, I can't vote for someone like that. And I said, well, that tells us a couple things about you. It tells us that you're a single issue voter. And she said, well, I don't want government telling me what I can do and what I should do and what I shouldn't do. And I said, well, you're looking at the federal government to tell you that it's okay and to give you permission to have and abortion. And I said, that's really not any different than having them tell you what you can't do or can do. You're still looking to the federal government to give you permission when, in fact, it's the right of the people to have freedom and make these choices for themselves. And in the context of this abortion topic, it's a semantics issue of, is it up to the federal government or is it closer to us in the states? And that's what you need to look at it in that context. And that's difficult and challenging for many people because we don't see our lives as a semantics puzzle. But semantics is important because semantics is what the Constitution is all about. Our personal rights and freedoms are enshrined in the Constitution and not in the federal government. Again, it's ironic that Bernie Sanders thought that Donald Trump was the greatest existential threat to our nation and to our freedoms because he himself found himself infiltrated and closed down by his own party. The only people who have infiltrated President Trump's movement in our time are the people themselves, we the people. And that's the best kind of infiltration we can have. If you would like to join us at Conservative Coffee Hour is every Saturday morning at 10 a.m. Central Time. I will include my email in the description of this video, and I'll be happy to send you an invitation. And I look forward to seeing you very, very soon.